I'm telling you this from a place where I can still sleep, most nights. I can still drive past the edge of Phoenix without feeling my hands tighten around an invisible steering wheel. That's the part that matters, the proof that I'm not calling you from the desert. I'm calling you from a normal apartment with normal walls, and the kind of quiet that's supposed to mean safety. I work nights moving equipment between departments and clinics, the jobs nobody thinks about until something is missing and someone's waiting. It isn't glamorous. It's keys and paperwork, clipped forms and wiped down handles, the stale smell of disinfectant that clings to your clothes long after you clock out. On that night, Phoenix was the same as always, bright in the wrong places and dark in the right ones. The heat had backed off, but the pavement still held it, and it rose in soft waves under the lights. I had just finished a run that should have been the end of it, a small piece of routine work that paid my hourly rate and kept my name out of trouble. I was walking toward my van with my badge still warm from the scanner, thinking about my bed and the kind of silence you only get when you live alone. My phone rang before I reached the driver's door. I saw the number and felt my stomach settle into that familiar weight, like a stone dropping into a shallow sink. Billing never called to ask how you were doing. Billing called because something had been sitting in a queue long enough that it couldn't be ignored anymore. I leaned against the side of the van and watched my breath fog the window for a second, then vanish. Tessa Morgan said quietly, "Evan, it's Tessa in billing. Your balance didn't go away, it just got louder." I tried to stay calm and said, "I'm working. That's all I can do." Tessa Morgan insisted, "Then pick up every shift they'll give you because the deadline's not moving." She didn't say it like a threat. She didn't need to. It was a calendar and a dollar sign and a list of consequences that didn't care if I was tired. I stared at my hands, at the faint lines of grime I could never scrub out completely, and I did the math without meaning to. I knew what I could cover if I took 2 extra nights. I knew what would happen if I didn't. Out here, in a city that ran on late shifts and blinking lights, you learned to treat money like oxygen. You didn't argue with the lack of it, you just tried to breathe anyway. I told her I understood. I didn't dress it up. There was nothing to dress up. When she hung up, the parking lot felt larger, like the space between the painted lines had stretched. The van's engine ticked softly as it cooled, and somewhere nearby a security cart rolled past with its headlights low, not looking at anything in particular. I had the door handle in my grip when the phone buzzed again. Different number, different kind of pressure. Cal muttered over the phone, "Evan, I need you on a run." He didn't ask if I was still on site. He didn't ask if I'd eaten. Dispatch didn't talk like that. Dispatch talked in a voice that assumed you were already moving. I could hear a radio in the background, a chair squeaking, the hollow sound of a room with too many screens and not enough windows. I looked up at the skyline, at the hard edges of the city against the night, and I thought about telling him I was done. I thought about saying I couldn't, that I needed to go home, that someone else could take it. Instead, I said yes, because the deadline wasn't moving, and neither was the kind of life that came after missing it. I should have refused. Cal gave me a bay number and a gate code, then the line clicked off like he was already done with me. I drove across the sleeping side of Phoenix, past the lit signs and the dark storefronts, and toward the place that always felt like it was operating in a different city. The streets around the main hospital were never fully quiet. Even at night there were headlights sliding through, delivery trucks easing into docks, the occasional siren cutting a straight line through everything else. I didn't need a name on the building to know where I was. The service entrance had its own geography, a maze of lanes and painted arrows, a cluster of chain-link fences and keypad gates, and sodium lights that made the concrete look the color of old bones. The gate took my code on the first try. That should have been a good sign. The barrier arm lifted with a mechanical sigh, and I rolled forward slowly, watching the mirrors for any last-minute pedestrian or cart. A security guard sat in a small booth with the window cracked, collar turned up, face lit by the blue glow of a phone. He looked up long enough to register the van, and then looked back down like I was part of the background. The service bay was half open, half sealed, with rolling doors that never seemed to rest in one position. One was raised halfway, leaving a dark gap that smelled like rubber mats and cleaning chemicals. Another was shut tight, its seams rimmed with dust. The ventilation system hummed constantly, a low vibration you felt in your teeth if you stood still long enough. Somewhere deeper in the building, a machine beeped in a steady rhythm, the kind of sound that became invisible when you worked around it too much. I parked where the painted lines told me to park, killed the engine, and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. The cabin went from engine noise to hush, but the bay outside still had its own life. A distant forklift reversed, its warning beep muffled. A cart rattled over a seam in the concrete. The air smelled of disinfectant, sharp and clean, the kind that made your sinuses ache. I stepped out and pulled my badge from my pocket out of habit, even though nobody had asked for it yet. The van keys were waiting in a lockbox on the wall, a small metal box with a keypad and a sticker that had been peeled and replaced too many times. I punched in the code Cal had given me, heard the click, and pulled out the ring. It had the usual weight, a few keys I didn't need, and one fob that did. I looked at the tag hanging from the ring, a faded label that had been written over and over, then tucked it in my fist, and walked around to the back. The cargo doors opened with a soft thud, and the smell of the bay poured in, cleaner and colder than the outside air. I did what I always did, because routine was the only thing that kept these runs from turning into mistakes. I checked the anchor points first, 4 metal loops bolted into the floor, scuffed and scratched from years of straps. I checked the straps themselves, rolled and clipped in their holders. I ran my fingers along the cabinet latch on the right, where we kept spare gloves, a basic toolkit, and a couple of disposable wipes. I tugged the latch to make sure it held. I checked the small overhead light, then left it off. Light inside the cargo area always made it harder to see outside, and I'd learned not to blind myself in places where anything could come through a door. I was still in the habit of counting things when footsteps approached. Not hurried, not casual. The kind of tired pace you got from someone who'd been on their feet for too many hours and didn't have any more energy to pretend otherwise. Marisol Reyes came into the edge of the light like she'd been carved out of it. She wore scrubs under a jacket that didn't match, hair pulled back tight, eyes flat with exhaustion. She didn't smile. She didn't waste time with greetings. She carried a hard case by the handle, rectangular, reinforced at the corners, heavy enough that the tendons in her hand stood out. A plastic tamper tag looped through the latch, bright against the dark case, with a serial number printed on it. She set the case on the edge of the cargo floor with a controlled motion, like she knew exactly what a drop would cost. Then she held up the tag between 2 fingers, letting me see it. Marisol Reyes said flatly, "Don't touch the tag. If it breaks, it's a report." I said, "Got it." She handed me a clipboard with a chain of custody form clipped on top, the paper stiff from too much handling. The form had boxes and lines and the kind of language that existed to make sure nobody could claim they didn't know what they were responsible for. I read it without really reading it, scanning for the details that mattered. Item description, serial number, destination, timeout. The case number was printed near the top in bold. I could hear the rolling doors shifting somewhere behind us, a motor whining, metal moving in slow inches. The security guard's cart rolled past the open bay, tires whispering. Marisol watched me sign, then leaned over and checked that I'd written in the right box. Her hand hovered close to the tamper tag like she was guarding it from my clumsy fingers. Jordan Pike showed up as if he'd been waiting for the moment when paperwork slowed down. He had a badge clipped to his belt and a small flashlight in his pocket, the kind of person who always carried the tools he needed because he never trusted anyone else to have them. His face was calm in that way techs got when they'd seen too many emergencies to react to them emotionally. He tapped the side of the case, not the latch, just the body, like he was listening for something inside. Jordan Pike told me, "Battery's full. Charger's in the pouch. Don't improvise." I nodded, because there was nothing smart to say back to that. Jordan's warnings were always short. They were meant to be remembered. He didn't tell me why not to improvise. He didn't have to. The stories were built into the way he said it. As Jordan stepped away, a sound slid into the bay so lightly I almost missed it. It was a tone, thin and clean, the beginning of a paging alert, the exact pitch the hospital used to summon people to places they didn't want to go. It didn't come from a speaker I could point to. It didn't come from a phone. It was just there for a moment, like a breath you felt more than heard. Marisol didn't look up. Jordan didn't pause. The security guard didn't react. The tone stopped as abruptly as it began, and the bay fell back into its usual hum. Marisol didn't comment. She just lifted the clipboard again and checked the tamper tag serial number against the form, then stepped back as if the handoff was complete the second the paperwork matched the plastic loop. My radio crackled, the sound sharp in the quiet between us. Cal's voice came through, clipped and practical, like he was reading off a screen. Cal said over the radio, "Case number Phoenix ER 1147, repeat it back." My voice came out steady when I said, "Phoenix ER 1147. Cal didn't answer with praise or reassurance. He just went quiet, like the repeat was all he'd needed. Marisol took the clipboard from me, tucked it under her arm, and gave the case one last look, as if she could tell by sight whether it was still honest. Then she turned and walked away into the deeper part of the bay, swallowed by the sodium light and the rolling shadows. I lifted the ventilator case into its spot, careful not to touch the tag. I set it down, centered between the anchor points, and ran the two straps over it exactly the way I'd been trained. Tight, even pressure, no twists. When I stepped back, it looked like nothing more than a box in the back of a van waiting to be moved. That was the problem with important things. Most of the time, they looked ordinary until the moment they weren't. Marisol didn't leave right away. She watched me cinch the straps, watched the way I kept my hands clear of the tamper tag, and watched the way I checked the latch twice without touching the plastic loop. When I finished, she stepped back into the open edge of the bay light and pulled a single sheet of paper from her jacket pocket. It wasn't a memo. It wasn't a friendly reminder. It looked like something printed from a system that expected obedience more than understanding, the kind of page that had been formatted, copied, and handed out so many times it had become normal. She held it out flat, not offering it so much as placing it in my path. Marisol Reyes said quietly, "Read them out loud." I said, "All right." I took the sheet and held it under the bay light. The paper was plain, but the text was sharp and clean. A list with numbers and short sentences that didn't leave room for interpretation. At the top, above the rules, there was a line of boilerplate language about safety and compliance. It mentioned the route in general terms, it mentioned after-hours conditions, and it mentioned equipment accountability. Nothing supernatural, nothing dramatic, just words that sounded like a hospital trying to protect itself from liability. That was part of what made it so easy to accept. I had seen enough policy sheets to know how they sounded. This one sounded exactly right. Marisol stood there like a supervisor waiting for an employee to confirm they'd been trained. Jordan Pike had already disappeared back into the building, and the security guard was still in his booth, still lit by his phone. The service bay's rolling doors shifted slightly again. Metal squealing in slow motion. Somewhere deeper inside, a cartwheel squeaked and then stopped. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath without knowing why. My radio crackled once, then cleared. Cal's voice came through, calm and precise, the kind of calm that made you realize he didn't think panic was useful. Cal said over the radio, "If it doesn't come with the case number, it's not for you." I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. That sentence was the spine of everything that followed, and he spoke it like he'd been repeating it for years, like it had saved other people before it ever reached me. I lowered my eyes back to the paper and started reading. After you pass mile marker 19, keep the cabin lights off. If you need light, use your phone screen at the lowest brightness. If dispatch messages you without a case number, don't acknowledge it. Don't open it twice. If you see emergency flashers ahead but you don't hear it on hospital radio, don't stop. Drive to the next marked checkpoint. Between mile 31 and mile 37, don't use the rearview mirror. Side mirrors only. If the overhead paging tone comes through your speakers, set the volume to 0 and count to 30 without looking at any clock. The ventilator case stays strapped with 2 straps. If it looks unbuckled, it isn't. Don't pull over to fix it outside a controlled gate. If a roadside call box is ringing, don't answer it. Don't slow down to see who's there. If GPS reroutes you to a road labeled Service 0 or shows no road name, ignore it and stay on the marked route. The words sat on the page like they belonged there. The first rule sounded like common sense. The desert was dark, and cabin lights could kill your night vision. The second rule sounded like a dispatch trick to prevent scams, something someone had added after a bad incident. The third rule was the first one that snagged, because it asked you to ignore something you were trained to respond to. The fourth one was stranger, but still framed as safety. The fifth one made my skin tighten because it assumed the paging tone could reach my speakers at all. The sixth rule sounded like pure procedure. The seventh and eighth felt like the kind of warnings you'd hear from anyone who'd driven those roads long enough. Marisol didn't react to any of it. She didn't explain. She didn't justify. She just waited while I finished. And when I looked up from the paper, she reached out and took it back like it was her property again. For a second, I almost asked her who wrote it. I almost asked her how many times she'd handed that sheet to other drivers. I almost asked her what happened to the ones who didn't follow it. But she was already stepping away, her tired face turned toward the open bay door, and I could tell the answers wouldn't be something she wanted to carry. She gave me one last look that wasn't a warning exactly, but it wasn't comfort either. It was the look you give someone when you know they're about to learn something you can't explain in a sentence. I climbed back into the van and shut the door. The cabin sealed me off from the service bay's hum and the disinfectant smell and the sodium light glare. My radio sat quiet on the dash. My phone rested in its cradle. I adjusted the mirror, then let my hand fall away and left it alone. When I started the engine, the sound felt too loud for the hour. The dashboard lit up, clean and ordinary. I put the van in gear and rolled toward the gate, the tires whispering across concrete. The barrier arm lifted again when I entered the code, and the night outside opened up. Phoenix spread behind me in hard blocks of light, while the road ahead disappeared into darker space. It was 10:47 p.m. The last of the service roads fed into the frontage lanes like a drain. I followed the arrows out of the back of house zone, kept my speed low, and watched for the small hazards you only notice at night. A stray cart, a distracted security patrol, a worker stepping out from behind a parked box truck. Once I cleared the final gate, the sound changed. It thinned out, spread wider, and became traffic again instead of machinery. I took the ramp onto I-10 and merged with the late-night flow, not fast, not slow, just steady. I left space in front of me and stayed out of the rightmost lane until the on-ramp ended, because the right lane was where people drifted when they were tired. I checked the radio first, the channel, the volume, the feel of the signal. The hospital band was clean and steady, the static low enough to ignore. I listened long enough to make sure there wasn't a second voice riding underneath. Then I let it be. Next, I checked the load without opening the doors. You learn to read a van by feel. I listened for a rattle that meant a strap had gone slack. I felt for the subtle sway that meant something heavy had shifted. I paid attention to the way the rear suspension sat under acceleration and then under a light brake tap. The back stayed planted. No loose weight, no delayed movement. Just the normal, solid sense of cargo being where it was supposed to be. Phoenix was still bright in the side mirrors, a low smear of orange and white. Ahead of me, the interstate was darker, the lane lines sharper by comparison. Overhead signs flashed back in my headlights like warnings I didn't have to read to understand. A mile marker slid by, then another, and the numbers meant nothing yet. Not until the ones on Marisol's sheet. Cal said over the radio, "Keep it simple. Drop, sign, leave." I said, "Copy." That was all. No reassurance, no extra detail. Dispatch didn't do comfort. It did outcomes. I drove on and let the city fall behind me one exit at a time, keeping my hands steady and my thoughts smaller than the road. Just after 11:05 p.m., the glow of Phoenix didn't disappear at once. It faded the way sound fades when you walk away from a crowded room. First the edges, then the color, then the last thin line on the horizon. Streetlights grew farther apart. Billboards became black rectangles. The low buildings and parking lots thinned out until there were gaps of true darkness between them. Even the traffic changed. The cars around me spaced out. Each one a separate bubble of headlights and taillights, moving through emptiness with a quiet kind of purpose. Inside the cab, everything became smaller. The windshield framed a narrow tunnel of pavement. The side windows held fragments, guardrail, scrub, the occasional signpost. The world outside moved, but it didn't feel alive. It felt like a place that didn't care whether I existed. I focused on concrete details that made a night run safe: speed, following distance, the slight shift in traction when the pavement texture changed, the way the wind hit the van when I passed a cut in the terrain. The tires held their steady hum. The engine stayed in a low note that didn't demand attention. The ventilation fan kept a soft, constant push that made the cab feel sealed off from the desert. The hospital radio stayed quiet. That was normal. It wasn't a social space. It was a line you didn't touch unless you had to. My phone stayed dark in its cradle. I didn't scroll. I didn't check the clock on the dash. I watched the lane markers and reflectors and let my eyes do their job, scanning far ahead, then near, then to the mirrors, then back. I counted passing headlights in the opposite lanes and watched them vanish behind me like they'd never existed. Past the last dense cluster of exits, the desert began to show itself in pieces. A wide, flat shoulder, low brush that looked gray under the moon, a sign warning about dust storms and sudden wind, another sign about emergency call boxes spaced miles apart. I read them automatically, then forgot the words and remembered only their shape. A semi rolled by in the right lane, its trailer a moving wall, and the air rocked the van as it passed. When it was gone, the road opened again, and the darkness felt closer, like it had stepped forward. Around 11:22 p.m., I was coming up on the Gila Bend exits. Gila Bend was a name that always sounded like a joke until you saw it at night. A few lights, a handful of buildings, and then the interstate kept going as if it hadn't noticed the town at all. I passed the exits without taking them. The signs slid overhead, green and reflective, pointing toward streets I would never see. A cluster of taillights peeled off toward town, and then the lanes around me went quiet again. For a minute I could see the outline of low structures in the distance, then they disappeared behind darkness and flat land. I started following the first rule early, not because I believed the list, but because it was easier to adjust while I still felt normal. I killed the cabin lights and let the dash glow be the only light inside. The difference was immediate. The windshield became cleaner, less reflective. The lane lines sharpened. My own face disappeared from the glass, and I didn't have to see my eyes staring back at me. I kept my posture still and let the dark settle into a routine. I kept my speed steady and stayed in the lane that required the least movement, because unnecessary lane changes were just another way to invite mistakes. When I needed to check anything, route notes, and ETA, the next exit number, I used my phone at the lowest brightness, a dull gray rectangle that barely lit my fingers. I kept it angled down so it wouldn't wash the windshield. I didn't hold it up. I didn't let it float in my peripheral vision. It stayed where it belonged, low and controlled. Then it went dark again. I could feel how much my eyes preferred it that way, how quickly they adjusted to the road, and it made the rule feel less like superstition and more like training. The van rode well. No rattles, no odd sway. The straps held. The ventilator case stayed invisible behind me, present only as weight and responsibility. I didn't think about the patient waiting on the other end. I didn't allow myself that. Thinking about people made drivers do stupid things. Thinking about procedures kept you alive. I watched the mile markers flick by and noted the numbers without attaching meaning yet, as if I could keep the rules asleep by not naming them. By 11:41 p.m., the run had settled into what I expected. The desert wasn't dramatic. It was flat and hard and empty. A wide black surface with occasional pale patches where sand caught moonlight. The wind came in slow pushes you felt through the steering wheel, a gentle sideways pressure that arrived, held, then let go. A truck passed in the other direction, its headlights washing the cab for a brief flash. Then it was gone, and my eyes had to readjust. That was when the speakers gave me something that wasn't music and wasn't speech. It was a faint artifact, a thin sound right on the edge of hearing. It didn't last long enough to identify. It could have been static. It could have been interference from a distant transmitter. It could have been nothing but the van's electronics doing what electronics did on an open road. The sound came, hesitated, and slipped away like it had changed its mind. I didn't reach for the volume. I didn't touch the channel. I kept my hands on the wheel and my gaze on the pavement. The fastest way to turn a harmless glitch into a problem was to stare at it. The brain hated uncertainty, so it tried to fill it in, and sometimes it filled it in with the worst thing it could imagine. I refused to give it material. I kept my breathing even and my eyes moving, far, near, mirrors far again. A few minutes later, another hint of it appeared, softer, closer to a tone, like a note trying to form but failing. My shoulders tightened, then I forced them down. I verified what I could by feel and habit, keeping my speed steady, my lane centered, my mirrors clear, and the dash free of warning lights, with open road ahead and nothing but darkness behind. The desert offered no context, no buildings, no trees, no landmarks that explained interference. Just open space and a ribbon of interstate. I told myself the sound was the price of distance, the kind of noise you got when you drove far enough that the city couldn't reach you anymore. I drove through it and let the tiny sound die on its own. If it mattered, it would return with a reason. If it didn't, I wasn't going to manufacture one. A little after midnight, a maintenance turnout appeared, like a mistake, a paved cutout and a battered sign with reflective letters. The shoulder widened, the lane markers changed. For a moment the road offered a place to stop. The turnout looked unused, the asphalt darker than the main lanes, dust gathered at its edges. There was a short stretch of guardrail, then a gap where you could pull off and face the desert. I didn't take it. Stopping at night was never neutral. It was either planned or it was trouble, and I hadn't planned it. Past the turnout, farther down the shoulder, a call box stood alone. It wasn't the kind you saw in the city. It was older, sun-faded, mounted on a post with a small light above it that didn't seem bright enough to do anything. In my headlights, it looked like a person for half a second, then resolved into metal and glass. I watched it as I passed and felt the urge to slow, to check if the light was on, to see if anyone stood near it. The urge wasn't rational. It was the same impulse that made you glance at a dark doorway in a hallway, even when you knew nobody lived there. I didn't slow. I kept the van moving and kept my eyes forward. The call box slipped out of view. The shoulder narrowed again. The desert closed back in, swallowing the option like it had never existed. The mile marker ahead ticked closer, then slid by, and I realized I'd been holding my jaw tight enough to ache. The feeling that someone had been there came anyway, and it didn't have a clean origin. There was no movement, no shadow, no figure in the ditch. It was just a presence you inferred, like finding a warm chair in an empty room and realizing it was warm because someone had just stood up. I checked my mirrors, quick and controlled, and saw nothing but darkness and the thin line of my own taillight stretching behind me. The van remained a sealed object cutting through a place that didn't want objects. The ventilation fan kept its soft push. The tires kept their steady whisper. I told myself the call box was just infrastructure, another piece of metal bolted into sand, and the feeling would go away if I ignored it long enough. At 12:18 a.m., the first message of the run arrived with the case number attached, exactly the way Cal had said it should. My phone lit up in the cradle with a soft glow, and I saw the identifier immediately. Case number Phoenix ER 1147, a normal check-in, a normal confirmation, the kind of thing dispatch sent to create a trail. It should have reassured me because it matched the one detail I could verify. Instead, it gave me a small, precise unease. The wording was correct, but it was stiff in a way I couldn't explain. It read like someone imitating the way Cal wrote, the way hospital staff wrote, the way a system was supposed to sound. There were no typos, there was no slang, there was no human mess. That was the problem. It was too clean, like a message assembled from templates and copied into place, polished until it lost the small imperfections that proved a person had touched it. I didn't reply. I didn't tap anything. I let the screen dim on its own and kept driving. Responding while moving only led to mistakes, and I'd learned to treat every communication as optional unless it carried urgency I could confirm. The message sat there, present but untouched, because I refused to give it attention twice or let it change my hands on the wheel. The road demanded enough of me already. I wasn't going to hand it more. The desert didn't change. The road stayed straight. Mile markers flicked past, white numbers glowing, and the van kept its steady pace toward the darker miles where the rules began to matter. I watched the horizon and the reflectors, and I felt the thin thread of routine tighten, as if something unseen had hooked it and started to pull. It was around 12:36 a.m. when the first hazard flashers appeared ahead, faint at first, then sharper as I closed distance. They didn't look like a patrol car. They didn't look like construction. They had that uneven, panicked rhythm you only got from someone who'd thrown on their four-ways without thinking. The kind of light that said something had already gone wrong. My foot eased off the gas before I made a decision. That wasn't bravery or caution. It was reflex, the same reflex that made you slow for a shadow on the shoulder or a deer-shaped smudge near the edge line. I watched the road surface for debris. I scanned the lane ahead for a stopped vehicle. I checked the shoulder for a figure stepping out into traffic. The interstate was otherwise empty, just my headlights and those pulsing lights, and the desert around it looked like it had been cut out of the world. The hospital radio stayed quiet. No crackle, no warning tone, no voice. The channel didn't drop. It was clean silence, like the radio had never been invented. That should have meant nothing. A crash out here could be a local driver, a tourist, someone who'd never touch a hospital band. The rule sheet didn't care about that. It didn't say stop if it looks real. It didn't say stop if you can't live with yourself afterward. It said something simpler, and it made my stomach tighten because it turned morality into a switch. If you see emergency flashers ahead but you don't hear it on hospital radio, don't stop. Drive to the next marked checkpoint. The urge to stop hit anyway. I imagined a person sitting behind the wheel with their head down, hazard lights blinking because their hands couldn't find the phone. I imagined someone standing in the lane waving, desperate, the kind of thing you couldn't unsee later. I imagined all the times I'd been told not to get involved, not to take risks outside protocol, not to create liabilities. None of that mattered when you put a human shape on the shoulder. I slowed more, enough that the van's nose dipped slightly. My hands tightened on the wheel. My eyes locked on the lights. Then, as I got close enough to see the silhouette of a vehicle, my brain caught up to the details that didn't match. The flashers weren't reflecting off anything. There was no spill of light across the asphalt the way there should have been. The pulses lit the air, not the road. They weren't grounded. They were suspended, like someone had hung them in the darkness and forgotten to attach the rest of the scene. I kept going. It wasn't heroic. It was mechanical. I stayed in my lane and held my speed just above crawling, not stopping, not pulling over, not turning my head too far toward the shoulder. I watched the right edge line because that's where someone would step out from. I watched the center because that's where debris would land. I waited for the radio to come alive, for Cal to say something, for a voice to give me permission to act like a person again. Nothing came. Then the paging tone hit my speakers. It wasn't faint. It wasn't buried in static. It was clean, sharp, the exact tone I'd heard leak into the service bay earlier, except now it was inside the cab with me, coming through the radio like the van had become an extension of the building. It made my skin tighten across my arms. It made my teeth ache. It was wrong because it was familiar. Familiar things didn't belong out here. My instinct was to reach for the radio knob, to twist it down, to change channels, to do anything that proved I had control. The rule sheet told me exactly what to do, and the simplicity of it felt cruel. If the overhead paging tone comes through your speakers, set the volume to 0 and count to 30 without looking at any clock. I moved my hand to the volume and turned it down all the way until the speakers went dead. The silence that followed didn't feel like relief. It felt like the moment after a door closes, when you realize you're the one who shut yourself in. I started counting. 1, 2, 3. I kept my eyes on the road. I didn't glance at the dash clock. I didn't look at my phone. I didn't check the time in the mirror's reflection. I stared at the lane markers and forced the numbers through my head in a steady rhythm, like a metronome I couldn't afford to lose. 4, 5, 6. The hazard flashers were still ahead, still pulsing, but the closer I got, the less they made sense. There was no vehicle shape now, only the lights hovering in a low band above the pavement. The desert offered no depth cues. Darkness flattened everything. I kept counting and kept driving. 7, 8, 9. The urge to look at a clock was its own kind of itch. It made you want to scratch it just to prove you could. I refused it. The rule didn't say count quickly. It didn't say count slowly. It just said count. So I counted at the pace my breathing allowed, steady, deliberate, and I let the road be the only thing I actually saw. 10, 11, 12. The van rolled past the lights. That's what it felt like, rolling past them, not through a scene, not by an accident, but past something that had been placed there. As I passed, the flashers slid sideways in my peripheral vision, like they were tracking me. I kept my gaze fixed forward and forced the numbers to continue. 13, 14, 15. My shoulders were rigid, my jaw hurt, my palms were slick against the wheel. I could feel my own heartbeat in my fingertips, but I wasn't allowed to let it change the count. 16, 17, 18. The moment I cleared the lights, the air in the cab felt different, not warmer or colder, just less charged, like I'd stepped out of a room where someone had been staring at me. The interstate ahead was empty. The shoulder was empty. In the mirror, there should have been a glow, a flicker, some evidence of what I'd just passed. There was nothing. 19, 20, 21. I kept counting because stopping early felt like a mistake. The rule didn't say stop when you think it's gone. It said count to 30. So I did. 22, 23, 24. The van's tires sang their steady note on the asphalt. The ventilation fan pushed air at my face. The desert stayed black and indifferent. My eyes stayed forward. 25, 26, 27. The urge to check the time spiked again, sharp and sudden, like my body wanted proof that this had lasted more than a second. I swallowed and kept counting. 28, 29, 30. Only then did I reach for the volume and bring it back up, not high, just enough that the radio's normal hiss returned. I listened for anything, a voice, a tone, a crackle. The channel remained silent. I looked ahead again, as if I'd been looking anywhere else. The road was open. The lights were gone. The crash was gone. There was no disabled car on the shoulder, no scattered debris, no human silhouette waving. It was as if the interstate had erased the whole thing behind me the moment I refused to stop. I told myself I'd imagined it. I tried to make my mind accept that explanation, because it was the easiest one to live with. Then the desert offered me something physical, small and undeniable. Fresh tire tracks ran in the sand beside the shoulder, parallel to the lane, clean grooves pressed into the pale dust. They weren't mine. I could tell by the spacing. They were too close to the edge and too perfectly straight, as if whoever made them didn't have to correct for wind or drift. They kept pace with the van for a short stretch, matching my movement like a shadow made of rubber and weight. Then they veered away into the dark and disappeared. My phone lit again in its cradle. The text on my phone read, "Good job." There was no case number attached, no identifier, no dispatch trail, just 2 words that felt like a hand placed on the back of my neck. I didn't touch the screen. I let it dim on its own, and I kept driving toward the next checkpoint, because the rule sheet had warned me not to open anything twice, and for the first time in my life, I understood why someone would write that down. It was around 1:07 a.m. when the first click came from the cargo area, a small sound that shouldn't have carried through the cabin, but did. It wasn't a bang. It wasn't the scrape of plastic against metal. It was the clean mechanical snap of a tension changing, the sound a strap made when it shifted 1 notch on a ratchet. I felt it more than I heard it, like the van's frame had transmitted the vibration straight into the steering column. My hands tightened. My eyes stayed on the road. I checked the side mirror, quick and controlled. The mirror showed the faint outline of the cargo doors. And, deeper inside, the dark shape of the case. Under normal light, I wouldn't have seen anything. Under the low glow of the dash and the thin wash of headlights bouncing behind me, my mind filled in what it could. The case looked slightly off, not toppled, not loose, just angled the way it shouldn't be angled if both straps were still doing their job. It was the kind of visual that made you want to pull over for 30 seconds, hop out, tug the straps, and keep going. That was exactly what the rule sheet had predicted. The ventilator case stays strapped with 2 straps. If it looks unbuckled, it isn't. Don't pull over to fix it outside a controlled gate. I kept driving. The seconds that followed were quiet enough that my brain tried to argue with me. It tried to tell me the rules were for rare situations and this was probably nothing. It tried to tell me equipment failures were real, and the patient on the other end didn't care about my fear. It tried to tell me I was being irresponsible by not checking. Then the phone lit up, and the argument stopped being internal. The text on my phone read, "Pull over and secure the case, not optional. No case number, no identifier. Nothing that proved it belonged to Cal or dispatch, just an order written in the tone of someone who expected compliance." It was the kind of message you could almost feel in your chest, the pressure of it, the way it tried to push you into a decision. I didn't touch the screen. I didn't open it again. I didn't even let my eyes linger long enough to be tempted. A mile later, the shoulder widened and a call box appeared, closer than the last one, its small light flickering like a dying firefly. As I approached, it started ringing. The sound was thin and metallic, carried across the empty desert in sharp bursts. It didn't sound like an emergency phone should. It sounded like an old landline in an empty office, the kind that rang until someone answered or the caller gave up. It rang as if it knew I was there. It rang as if it had been waiting for the exact moment my van came into range. The rule sheet had predicted that too. If a roadside call box is ringing, don't answer it. Don't slow down to see who's there. I held the speed steady and kept the van centered in the lane. The ringing grew louder as I neared, then peaked as I passed, then faded behind me. For a moment, the desert felt like it was full of listening. The next checkpoint was still ahead. I could see the faint outline of a barrier arm in the distance, a small cluster of reflectors marking a turnout that wasn't meant for tourists. It wasn't a building. It wasn't a town. It was just infrastructure, a controlled point on a road that didn't have many. I aimed for it like it was the only solid thing left. As I drove, the sound behind me started to change. It began as a low rush, like wind, then turned into something with rhythm. A steady presence in the rear of the van, not the usual tire noise, not the normal engine note. It felt like something moving in sync with me, not inside the cargo area, but behind the vehicle, close enough that my instincts kept trying to check the rearview mirror. The mile markers climbed. 31 approached like a line in a story you didn't want to reach. Between mile 31 and mile 37, don't use the rearview mirror. Side mirrors only. I adjusted my gaze and stopped looking at the rearview mirror entirely. I didn't glance at it. I didn't use it for comfort. I treated it like it wasn't there. I relied on the side mirrors, left and right, narrow windows that gave me just enough information to drive and not enough to satisfy my fear. The sound behind me grew heavier. It wasn't a single noise. It was a mix of things, a faint tire hiss that didn't match my own, a low thrum that rose and fell like a vehicle hovering in my blind spot, and an occasional soft tap that made the hair on my arms lift. It sounded like something testing the edges of my awareness, pushing against the places my vision couldn't reach. Every instinct screamed to confirm it, to check the rearview mirror and see what was there. I didn't. The desert to my right was an endless black slope. The left lanes were empty. The road ahead stayed clean, straight, indifferent. My hand stayed fixed on the wheel. The side mirror showed only darkness and the thin red smear of my own taillights. The sound persisted anyway, like it didn't need to be seen to exist. My GPS chimed bright and cheerful, the wrong tone for the hour. The screen changed and a new route line appeared. It tried to reroute me onto a road labeled Service 0. The map showed a thin line peeling off into darkness with no street name, no exits I recognized, no landmarks. The system acted as if it was obvious, as if any driver would take it without question. The line shaved time off the ETA. It promised a faster route, a clean solution, exactly what a tired brain wanted. If GPS reroutes you to a road labeled Service 0 or shows no road name, ignore it and stay on the marked route. I stayed on I-10. The moment I committed to the lane, the hospital radio emitted the paging tone. It hit the cabin like a knife, clean, familiar, impossible. The speakers carried it with perfect clarity, not static, not interference, as if I had driven the van into the building's ceiling speakers. My body reacted before my mind did. My pulse jumped, my fingers tightened, my mouth went dry. Then the tone stopped, and a voice came through. A voice came through the hospital radio and said, "Phoenix ER, 1147, Evan Carver." It put a hard pause in my last name, like it was reading me off a label. It read the case number correctly. It didn't stumble over it. It didn't hesitate. It landed each piece cleanly, like it had practiced. Then it said my name. It didn't say it wrong by much. That was the worst part. It was one small break in rhythm, one tiny mispronunciation, the kind of mistake you'd forgive in a crowded waiting room. But the mistake carried a message. It meant the voice knew the shape of my name without caring enough to honor it. It meant I had been entered into something, logged the way equipment got logged, labeled, and tracked, not as a person, but as a moving part. I didn't answer. I didn't speak into the radio. I didn't say yes or no or what do you want. I kept my eyes forward and my hands steady, because if the rule sheet had taught me anything, it was this. The road didn't require my voice. The thing in the radio did. I held the lane through the mile 31 to mile 37 segment without once looking into the rearview mirror. Every second felt longer than it should have. The sound behind me shifted and pressed closer, as if it was trying to force my eyes to break the rule. The side mirrors showed nothing. The darkness stayed empty. The noise stayed there anyway, persistent, patient, waiting for the moment I would do the simplest thing. Look. I didn't. Ahead, the checkpoint barrier finally came into view, reflectors bright in my headlights. Beyond it, off to the side, was a turn that looked like it belonged to service vehicles, a path into a smaller world of gates and concrete pads and sodium lights. The GPS line still tried to peel away toward Service 0, but I ignored it and stayed on the route I could see. The radio went quiet again, and the silence felt staged, like a person stepping back to see if you'd learned the lesson. I kept driving toward the controlled barrier, because it was the first place on that stretch of road that felt like it could still belong to humans. It was around 1:49 a.m. when the road gave me something that looked like a finish line. The desert had been the same for miles, black shoulder, pale sand, and reflectors blinking back at me like slow, patient eyes. Then, a cluster of lights appeared ahead, low and steady, and a lane split off from the interstate in a way that felt familiar. There was fencing, there was a paved approach, and there was a sign on two posts that should have made it all make sense. The sign didn't. It had been sun-bleached to the point of losing its certainty. Letters that should have been crisp were faint and uneven, like they'd been traced from memory. The spacing looked slightly wrong, the kind of wrong you can't measure but still feel. It was close enough that a tired brain wanted to accept it. It was wrong enough that my skin tightened anyway. I slowed, not to stop, just to make the turn clean, and I watched the entrance as if it might correct itself at the last second. A barrier arm waited at the end of the short approach. There was a keypad on one post and a camera dome on the other. The arm should have stayed down until I entered a code. It should have demanded a badge scan or a call from inside. Instead, as my headlights washed over it, the barrier lifted on its own. Smooth, automatic, practiced, like it recognized me. I rolled forward under the arm without touching anything. The lane narrowed into a corridor of chain-link fence on both sides, guiding me toward a concrete pad lit by sodium lamps. The lights buzzed and flickered, the color bruised and stale. One fixture pulsed, dimmed, then recovered, as if deciding whether it wanted to stay on. The air felt colder in that corridor. Not weather cold, refrigeration cold, the kind of cold you associate with sealed doors and clean surfaces. An intercom pole stood to my left. The speaker grill looked worn, the button below it dull from too many presses. The paging tone hit first, clean and sharp, and then the speaker crackled with a voice that sounded like procedure. The intercom crackled and said, "Report to intake." I didn't answer. I didn't even look at the button. There was no intake desk in sight, no rolling bay door opening, no person stepping out with a clipboard. The corridor widened into a small loading area with faded paint lines on the concrete. Beyond the fence, another gate sat in the distance, another barrier, another layer of control. It looked like the skeleton of a facility without the body. I stopped on the concrete pad with the brake held. The engine idled. My headlights washed the fence and the far gate in white. The sodium lights painted everything else yellow and wrong. I listened for human noise, for carts, for footsteps, for any sign that this place belonged to people. I heard only the engine and the thin electrical buzz overhead. The quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt staged. Then I felt it. A small change in the van. A shift behind me. Not the weight moving, but the idea of the door's changing state. A soft metallic settle, like a latch easing. I killed the engine. The silence dropped heavy and immediate. For a second, I just sat there, hands still, letting my hearing search the space. Nothing moved. The lights continued their faint buzz. Somewhere on the fence, a strip of metal ticked once in the wind, dry and irregular. I got out. The air outside the cab was colder than it should have been and carried a faint sterile smell, like a clean supply room that had just been wiped down. I walked to the rear doors slowly, keeping my steps measured. The right door sat slightly proud of the left, just enough to let a strip of sodium light leak into the seam. The doors had unlatched a crack. I pulled the right door open. The ventilator case was still there, centered where I'd placed it. The tamper tag still looped through the latch, bright against the dark metal. But the straps were wrong. Both straps had been undone, not cut, not ripped, not hanging in a mess. They were unbuckled and folded neatly, each one laid flat with the ratchets aligned, like a hand had completed a handoff and set the restraints aside the way a professional would. That neatness turned my stomach. Chaos would have been easier to understand. I reached in and grabbed the case handle. The metal was freezer cold, shockingly cold, like touching a steel shelf in a walk-in. The cold bit hard enough to sting, and it didn't stop at my skin. It felt like it pushed into my fingers, into my bones, a clean burn that made my grip falter for a fraction of a second. The resistance met me immediately. Not a violent yank, not a sudden jerk. A steady pull in the opposite direction, slow and controlled, like someone on the far side was receiving the case according to a protocol. The case didn't slide toward me the way it should have. It held, then edged backward, millimeter by millimeter. The handle pressed into my palm like it wanted to tear free. The case wasn't being stolen. It was being accepted. The radio in the cab clicked once, as if it had been waiting for the moment my hand touched the case. Then the voice came through, flat and certain. The voice on the radio said, "This isn't delivery, it's training." The words landed like a policy statement. No anger, no excitement, no breath. The voice on the radio said, "Rules aren't protection, they're triage." The pull increased, not faster, just heavier. My forearms strained. The cold spread into my fingers until they felt clumsy, as if the sensation was being dulled on purpose. The case shifted an inch, then another, sliding deeper into the van as if the floor had turned slick. For a moment, the darkness beyond the cargo area looked deeper than it should have, not because of shadows, but because the light didn't seem to settle there the way it should. I let go. The handle snapped up slightly as the resistance vanished, and the case slid backward on its own, stopping as if it had reached a mark I couldn't see. The strap stayed folded. The tamper tag stayed intact. Everything about it screamed compliance, not theft. My body moved before my thoughts could catch up. I slammed the doors shut hard, metal on metal. I threw the latch down and checked it twice, fast, not careful. Care was for normal nights. I ran back to the driver's seat, started the engine, and put the van in reverse. The backup camera lit the screen in harsh yellow. The concrete pad, the fence, the intercom pole, no people, no movement. I backed up quickly, tires crunching grit, then turned hard to line up with the entrance corridor. The barrier arm was still raised, still welcoming. I didn't slow. I drove out the way I came in as if the place might change its mind if I hesitated. The moment the van crossed under the barrier and out of the sodium-lit corridor, the air warmed by a fraction, just enough to notice. The interstate reappeared like something honest, painted lines and reflectors in the familiar emptiness of the desert. The fence and the bleached sign fell behind me and vanished into darkness. I didn't stop until I was back under normal highway lighting, and the entrance was gone from my mirrors. Only then did I look down at the paperwork on the passenger seat. The chain of custody form was still there. The ink I'd signed was still mine. But there was a new mark in a box I hadn't touched, small and official, like a system update. Not a name, not a signature I recognized. Just a clean notation that suggested the handoff had been logged without me. It didn't prove anything to anyone else. It proved enough to me. By the time I reached the real intake area, the road had started to look human again. The interstate bled into surface streets, then into service lanes marked by clean reflectors and fresh paint. The lights were steady here, not flickering sodium that made everything look bruised. There were other tire marks in the dust, other deliveries that had come and gone, proof that this place existed whether I did or not. I didn't open the cargo doors again. I couldn't risk giving it another chance to change. I parked in the loading lane, killed the engine, and sat for 1 second with my hands still. The paperwork on the passenger seat looked ordinary if I didn't stare at it too hard. I grabbed the clipboard and stepped out, keeping my eyes forward, keeping my pace normal. The intake door was plain and functional, a buzzer panel, a small camera, a narrow window with a glare that hid whatever was behind it. A nurse met me at the threshold with a badge on a lanyard and the calm posture of someone who'd been awake all night. She looked at the clipboard first, then at me, then past me toward the van as if she could already see the answer there. Nurse Delgado said calmly, "We already got it." The words hit like a mistake, the kind you correct by saying the same thing again, louder. I didn't get louder. My throat felt tight, and my voice came out flatter than I meant it to. I said, I drove it here myself. Nurse Delgado didn't argue. She didn't accuse me of lying. She shifted half a step and angled her body so I could see a workstation just inside. A monitor turned slightly toward the door. The screen showed the logistics entry with the case number, Phoenix ER 1147. Under it was a status line that made my stomach drop. Completed, received, logged. Nurse Delgado told me, system says completed, signed and time-stamped. I leaned closer without crossing the threshold. The signature wasn't mine. It wasn't even close. It was quick and confident, like someone signing a form they'd signed 1,000 times. The timestamp sat in the middle of the run, during the stretch between mile 31 and mile 37. The exact part of the road where I hadn't been allowed to use the rearview mirror, where sound had pressed in behind me and the radio had spoken my case number like it owned it. I started to speak, then stopped. I could feel the argument trying to build, facts lined up like a report, but the more I reached for them, the less human the situation felt. Nurse Delgado's expression didn't change. It wasn't cruel. It was procedural, like the system had already decided what was true. So I nodded once. Small, final. I backed away from the door and walked back to the van with the clipboard held too tight. The loading lane was quiet. A distant generator hummed. Wind pushed grit across the pavement in thin lines. I climbed into the driver's seat and didn't start the engine. The cab sat dead and still. Then, very softly, the paging tone whispered through the speakers, less than a second, just enough to make my chest tighten. My phone lit up with a new message. No case number, no identifier, just a notification, like a fresh entry had been added somewhere. I didn't touch the screen. I watched it dim on its own, and I didn't open it twice.